We are going to go back into the book of Micah. And today we are going to be focusing on the second half of chapter 4, verses 6 through 13. But before I do that, I do want to reflect on the verse, the passage that the worship team did bring up to us from Revelation 21, 1 through 4. Because one of the things for me is, as I look at the world around us, as I talk to my family, as I talk to my mom in Ohio or my sister in Montana or friends, we're in an odd time. We've had an odd year. There's a funk. There's just if there's anything that we can agree upon right now is that we need hope. And before I study the passage, before we jump into that, I want to restate that vision of hope that came from Revelation. And that looks so much better. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." Family, there is a time coming when all things will be made new. And the people of God will be with God, in harmony with God, in harmony with God's creation, in harmony with one another, with no pain, no fear, no anxiety within us, no community divides, no tense election seasons, no apprehensive transfer of power, no oppressive leadership, no abusive powers, no war among the nations, no sickness, no cancer, no pandemics, no tears, no pain forever. And the author John went on to say that he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I'm making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." These are for us. Can you imagine that, though? Can you imagine what that hope looks like? But we're not there yet. We're not. What I just read, is not our reality. So what is our reality? Our reality is that sin breaks things. That's the world that we live. Not only does sin break things out there, I mean, I can look at a lot of things and say, yep, that's broken, that's broken. But sin breaks things in here. And that is our problem. That is our reality. It's not just their problem. It's not just the problem of, as my dad would always say, those idiots. It's not just a problem of the other side. It's the human problem. It's my problem. It's your problem. It's our problem. Because of sin, because of our sin, because of my personal sin against God, we incur a debt against Him. And God must deal with us justly. And as we've been walking through the book of Micah, we've been learning about God's justice and God's judgment. So our reality is that sin breaks things, but as we learn about God's judgment, we also understand that judgment is painful. In Micah, it's a book that speaks of judgment against false gods, oppressive powers, insidious corruption. The thing that was striking to me on this is, these are things that we'd often identify as, well, that's the world. God's people were different. But what Micah is pointing out is that these are all things that the world, yes, had been known for, but they have now settled in and taken root within the hearts of God's chosen people. The corruption of the world has now found home with God's people. This is our reality. We live in a broken world, broken by sin, and we ourselves are broken. We live in a time of pain. We ache, we groan, because we know it's not supposed to be this way. So for me, admittedly, as I got into the book of Micah, it wasn't too far of a stretch to step into this book and relate to it on a personal level. Micah's message is very personal. It's powerful and personal. He burned with indignation against social injustice, against wealthy oppressors who take from the poor. He boldly rebuked the rulers, the prophets, the priests who fail to walk worthy of their vocation. And he condemned the hypocrisy of the common people towards their relationship with God. We have heard God's prophet Micah speaking to God's people. And this took place more than, 2,700 years ago? And what we're reading is as relevant today as it was for those folks. As relevant as it was for Israel and Judah back in around 730 BC or so. So we have been and we should continue to be sobered at Micah's message as it powerfully reveals God's majesty in his judgment. But as we've turned the pages into chapter 4, we're also going to be powerfully reminded of God's mercy for his people. So again, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on Micah 4, 6 through 13. And let's start off at the top. Verses 6 through 8. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted. And the lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion, for this time and forevermore. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, and to you shall it come. The former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. So after chapters of judgment and destruction, hope now cuts through as God reveals his mercy and his desire for restoration. Oftentimes I get caught up when I read about judgment, that judgment ends in destruction. But that's not God's plan. Restoration is to be the final outcome of judgment. Judgment doesn't just end with destruction. Even though destruction was right and just, it doesn't end there. Through judgment, through destruction, will come perfect restoration. The end, the hopeful end, is restoration. God's kingdom will be completely restored. God's people will be in God's place under God's rule again. And admittedly, this is one of those areas where in reading prophecy, okay, when are we talking about now? And in that day still harkens back to the beginning of chapter 4, where most scholars, most folks believe that we're in that millennial reign. That's kind of where we are. We're looking forward. Someone had once described to me that prophecy is kind of like coming up and driving close to a mountain range. As you see these mountains in front of you, it's like, wow, there's that cluster of mountains. I can see this peak and that peak, and I remember driving up in the Canadian Rockies and just being in awe of the mountains that I saw. And especially if you're out in the plains, in the wheatlands, and then getting closer to the mountains, you just see these beautiful array of mountains. But once you finally start to get into those mountains, you maybe hit that first mountain peak area. It's like, oh, well, here it is. But if I did what is that, about a 90-degree turn? If I got in over that next mountain that I saw that looked like a cluster, boy, that's a ways off. That perspective is amazingly different. So some are close and some are far, and that's kind of what prophecy feels like to me. Even as we're walking through this portion of Micah, some of it is far away, some of it is closer. Some is partially fulfilled, some is far, far yet to be filled. But to me, rather than maybe getting caught up in kind of where am I or when am I, but what does this mean? What is God speaking to me in the same way that he's speaking to the folks of Israel and Judah at the time? So when I think about this, when I look at the hope revealed here, is this the hope that I truly hope for? So let's examine it a little bit closer. Who does God gather? When I, as long as I'm strong enough, as long as I'm sturdy enough, I can make it through times of trial or despair but in that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those who I have inflicted. At the time of this writing, if we considered the lame, in our day, we have the American Disabilities Acts and so forth that, we have been taught and we take care of our folks within our society. Back in this day, the lame were set aside. They were left to fend on their own. So this really, to me, carries even a heavier weight of who were the lame. Who were those that were driven away? Who were those that were afflicted? The cast off. So it is out of this weakness that folks are being gathered, out of the affliction that we're brought back. A remnant remains. And boy, I was telling Jeff this as I was studying this the last couple of weeks, just the idea of remnant is something that's a little scary to me. Because remnant means such a small piece. It's a minority. And wow, what does that mean for me? Where am I part of that minority? Am I part of that remnant? My desire is to be so, but it's kind of a frightening term to me to think of remnant. So God gathers, but who's going to reign? It speaks of God pulling us together. The former dominion shall come, kingship of the daughter of Jerusalem. This was a little bit of a haunting phrase when I saw that line there, the former dominion shall come. Because as I read the entirety of the Bible, and if I understand bits of the Old Testament, how many times did Israel and Judah really just kind of mess it up? They kind of lived a little bit with some of the good old days syndrome that we sometimes deal with. Like, boy, it was certainly better back then. And I think for them, boy, it was certainly better back when David was there, when David was in charge. I think about myself. I grew up, I was born in '63, so I grew up in the 60s, in the 70s, and there's parts of my childhood that are just so sweet. There were things that I remember I just loved. I lived the Wonder Years life where we'd run out the door, we'd play ball all day long. Moms would call each other to let someone know, hey, the kids are staying over for lunch over here today. It was ideal. I would love, in my mind, to go back. That's that former time. That's that former reign that, boy, I would love. I was a child, though, during that time. So if I think about it now, as I love watching history, the 60s, I want to go back to that. Wow. The race issues that we had, the assassinations, Vietnam. I grew up in Ohio. Kent State was 30 miles from my house. You know, it was a tumultuous time. But for me, those are my good old days. And again, out of the eyes of a child, perhaps they were. But I'm not sure if I'd ask my mom if that would be a time that she would want to go back to. And so when I think of the good old days syndrome, you know, do I get stuck in that? If these inconveniences in my life right now could just go away, just get me back to the way that it was. Just get me back to where I was comfortable. Just get me back to when I was happy. When will things be normal again? When can I go back to the way things were? For me personally, in the season that we are in, I'm trying very hard to understand within my own life, what are the things that I need to change so that I don't go back to just the way that it was? I'm not sure if the way that it was is really where God always wants us. I hate distractions, but I'm wondering, has God distracted me to a point that I need to figure out for Tim, what is this distraction here for? And so that's one of the things, as I was haunted by that statement for Israel, the former dominion shall come, and I can just see them saying, yes, can't wait till we get back to that. And then they just get right back on the stream that they were before, mixing themselves with the world and what the world says success and happiness and all that is. So that was just something that popped to me. Are we hoping for restoration of God's kingdom or our own? It reminded me, I saw something this week about an article of we don't have much to be thankful for at Thanksgiving. I was like, whoa, you know, what's going on? What's this mean? Sometimes when we glibly say, oh yeah, I'm thankful for, you know, my health, my family, these are all good things. But what are we truly thankful for? We don't have much to be thankful for unless we truly are thankful for God's salvation in our lives. That is what much to be thankful for is. So again, I don't want to minimize the joys that we have in this life, but sometimes I don't think we're thankful for much if we just focus on the minority type things that we have going on. And I know I'm going to get in trouble from Janice, but are we looking at a Hallmark hope or a holy hope? My mom loves the Hallmark Channel and all the Christmas stuff. I admit I haven't watched it. I always thought it was pretty white people with problems channel, but maybe I'll have to watch it one of these days. But again, are we focused on a Hallmark hope in our lives or really a holy hope of what God has for us? A new land established where the weak will be made strong, the lame will be made whole, and those who are cast off are gathered again, and God himself will reign and be king over them forever. So out of judgment comes salvation, not just a shallow hope for better days or for happiness, but a salvation that penetrates completely through our reality of sin and pain. It penetrates completely for us as God's people. A salvation that is redemption, a salvation that is justification, a salvation that is purification, and a salvation that is sanctification. Our hope is in heaven. We should place our hope there and live in a way that we intend to meet it there. Not place our hope in the things of this world. Restoration is not the target to save things and only to allow them to continue as they are or that they were. Restoration is targeted to redeem, to truly be made good, to truly make things the way that they're supposed to be, the way that God designed it. So this hope that Micah delivers in the midst of despair, this is restoration in judgment. With that as the foundation, then Micah moves on to tell them what they need to know. And I think of what we need to know. And he uses a series of metaphors. So we've talked about the future, the real hope that is out there, that God is in control. God will establish his kingdom. He will fulfill his promise through restoration, but we are here now. So Micah was talking about in that day, but then he turns it and he says, "Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished? That pain seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hands of your enemies." So during this time, destruction was knocking on the door for those in Judah, for those in Jerusalem. Samaria had been, or was even in the process of being wiped out by the Assyrians. And the Assyrian army, with all their vassal armies that they were bringing together, was starting to make their way down to Jerusalem. David's throne would soon be sitting empty, and God's people would be carried off in captivity to Babylon. And this is kind of an amazing thing, because if I got the timing right, Babylon overtakes Jerusalem in around 586 BC. And so this is 150 years even before that happens. Babylon wasn't even that power at that point. The Assyrian army had actually displaced Babylon somewhat close to them. And so Babylon was like, kind of a non-entity, non-factor at that point. So he's even pointing towards, again, where within those mountain ranges are we? Well, that's still a little further out, but right now, Jerusalem, they're crying out loud. So the people hear of the destruction and the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, and they hear of the approaching Assyrian armies towards Jerusalem. And Micah hears the cries, the groans, the anguish of the people as their hope in their king is failing. Interestingly, Micah doesn't deny their pain. To me, being of sarcastic bent myself, I almost felt that this was like a sarcastic statement of like, why are you crying out loud? Well, yeah, you need to cry out loud. But it's really recognizing that he doesn't deny their pain. He doesn't even tell them to stop. He actually tells them to continue. You feel like crying? Cry out loud, because it's only going to get worse. But he goes on to show, though, that pain is with purpose. He says that the weeping is like the groaning of childbirth. He doesn't deny the pain and the sorrow that's taking place in judgment, but he uses this imagery to say that there will be an end to that pain. There will be an end to that sorrow, and this pain and sorrow will yield gain in redemption and rescue. That through this very painful suffering and pain, hope will come. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hands of your enemies. So judgment is taking place as the backdrop of God's salvation to be enacted. God's purpose is that out of destruction much good will come. Judgment will be like childbirth, bringing gain out of pain. So to me, that's one of those things of encouragement that Micah takes us, lets us know what's coming, but he keeps bringing us back to understanding God's purpose, God's plan for redemption, God's plan for deliverance. And so once again, we go back to the now. In verse 11, "Now many nations are assembled against you, saying, 'Let her be defiled, and let our eyes gaze upon Zion.' But they do not know the Lord's thoughts. They do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron. I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat in pieces many people, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. So there is still pain, but he turns it in showing us that there is still gain. There is still purpose within this pain. So the impending destruction will happen as many nations surround Jerusalem, looking to cast down, looking to destroy her. But the purposes of the nations are not God's purposes. God is still in control. God is the one who has gathered and assembled them, but they will do his bidding, not theirs. So they have come to a threshing floor where they will be threshed. And finally, I had something that I felt that I could talk about on this one. I used to work for General Mills, and I used to work in the milling division. And that was an area that I was comfortable with. And when I saw the word threshing, I knew what it was talking about. I knew going out there and harvesting the wheat. Right off the bat, we're separating wheat from the straw and the chaff and that type of thing. But even as we bring wheat into the mill, probably over 30 to 40% of the energy expended at a flour mill is just on the cleaning process of the wheat itself. So when the wheat comes into us, it's called dirty wheat, and we turn it into clean wheat, and then clean wheat, we mill that clean wheat. And so dirty means, it has rocks, it has pebbles, it has bunny feet, it has, who knows what that's coming out of that field. And I was always amazed at the cleaning process within the mill is immense, and the physics behind it and the mechanical energy behind it is amazing. We use things like aspiration and gravity and density and size and friction and all these different pieces of machinery that are specific to get out, well, this machine gets out these little seeds, this machine gets out this stone. We have sifters and sieves, so that we have some things that go over the top, some things that go under the bottom, and then the wheat kind of comes right through the middle. So we're constantly manipulating it and putting physical force against it to get it to a point where that wheat is clean and ready to be milled. And even if we put all that energy against it, wheat is kind of difficult because it has this little crease in the middle, and you can still have some dirt and things there. And so it's like, well, a little bit of dirt is good for us, but we do our best to get it clean. So in this case, back in this day, they used to bring all the wheat on its stalk and lay it down on a threshing floor, and then they would take a sledge, which was like a sled, and with an ox run back and forth so that we're grinding off the pieces that are not necessarily going to be valued as the final wheat to be able to mill it. And so in this particular case, it says, your horn will be like iron, your hooves will be like bronze. So Israel, the daughter of Zion, is essentially the ox. Your horn are indestructible. You have iron horns, you have bronze hooves. You will be doing this threshing. You will be destroying and knocking away things that are evil. Threshing has a purpose in God's judgment to purify his people. In judgment, evil will be destroyed and good will be refined. And again, Micah ends with hope in verse 13 that the daughter of Zion will emerge victorious and purified after the impending disaster. So when I think of the disaster, when I think of destruction, in this particular case, I had a little hard time saying, okay, well, Israel's going to win and we're just going to get rid of all the evil. I put myself in the position of that kernel of wheat as well. What is it inside of me that needs to be purified? What is it inside of me that needs to be threshed? What part of me needs to go to the cleaning system so that I'm no longer dirty wheat, but I'm now clean wheat? And I recognized in myself how often I like to hold on to that waste. In the mill, we called it the waste stream. So it went off and we sold it into, it was either destroyed or it went into dog food or animal feed. There was all these different things that everything was used to some degree. But for me personally, what is God working to purify in my life that I still want to hold on to? When I think of that wheat kernel, some things are held the husk of that wheat kernel is held very tightly to that wheat kernel. And it's the hardest thing to get off. What am I holding on to? Yesterday I was in the book of Proverbs, and I hit the one, and it kind of rang true for me as, kind of like the dog returning to its vomit, or the pig that once it's clean goes back and rolls in the mud again. Where in my life am I being purified? But man, I just want to jump right back into it. I think I'd rather jump in the mud than jump into the vomit. But the point was, for me, where is God trying to purify me? Judgment is taking place for a purpose. God's purpose is to refine his people, to purify them from evil and destroy their enemies. Judgment will be like the threshing floor, separating the wheat from the chaff. So as I read through the book, as we have been reading through the book of Micah, it is a tough book. Books of prophecy can be tough. The judgment, the discipline that I'm feeling is tough. But I enjoyed seeing this ray of hope. I enjoyed trying to understand, where is purpose in pain? And for me, the thing that was really neat, and I just want to share this in closing couple minutes, the personal application that I hope maybe would be an encouragement to you as well, because it started to expose some of the greater harmonies across God's Word in connecting my own need for hope and restoration and refinement. In 1 Peter 2, 11 through 12, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." For me, this was something that has been a theme over the last 8 to 10 months, inside of me wanting to have a level of empathy that I know that I did not exist before. When I hearken back to, the race issues that we have seen within our own community, when I think about this era that we're in with a pandemic, I like to dig into books. I read a book on Martin Luther King. I read a book to understand some of the speeches and things that he did, and it created in me an empathy that I didn't have before. I spent 24 hours, Cindy, I think it was, on Amazon Prime. I went through a series. It was one of these great courses on the plague, on the Dark Ages plague. And it was interesting to see parallels within our culture about things that occurred, over 700, I forget how many years ago. But even how it affected culture, how it affected the church, but what the plague did to Europe during that period was amazing to see. I read a book called The Deadliest Enemy by Michael Osterholm out of the University of Minnesota. He was now part of appointed to the COVID task force for Joe Biden. But he used to do work for consulting for us at General Mills on infectious disease and certain type of things. And so I wanted to understand more about infectious disease. And interesting read. And it's amazing. This was written 4 or 5 years ago, and he gave kind of a scenario of what would happen if a pandemic occurred. it's a little frightening how right he was on so many different things. Right now, I'm reading a book, Abraham Lincoln, called The Team of Rivals. How did Abraham Lincoln, after becoming president, how did he surround himself? He surrounded himself with rivals from within his own party to be part of his cabinet. And it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. How do we surround ourselves with people that actually don't have the same opinion as us? So that was something for me as an exile I'm called to witness. I'm an exile of heaven in this world. How do I witness to those around me? The other call was to endure and grow. In James 1 through 4, James, a servant of God and the Lord of Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, exiles, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And the thing that I've recognized for myself is that this, again, for me personally, we are living in a time where it seems like everything is about COVID, and I don't want to live there. But I recognize within my friends and family, it's something that is often discussed. How can I help them? How can I help them with enduring? My mom at 90 she's doing fine, but I'm still trying to encourage her in that. How can I encourage? I have a sister that's on one spectrum. I have another sister that's on the other end of kind of the debate around many of these type of things. How can I be of help to both of them? I want to be able to endure, not just escape. And ultimately, enduring and living for a future hope. This is the thing that I really learned from Micah. And as I was studying, it took me back to the time where Carlton and I were finishing up the book of Romans after Pastor Rick had retired. And I had preached on Romans 8 through 25, and I just want to read through this. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed for us. For creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him, God, who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know the whole creation has been groaning together, yes we have, in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption of sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So I hope for me, just sharing what Micah has taught me, what God has taught me through Micah in this season, is something that would be an encouragement and a blessing. That through judgment comes restoration. That through pain, there is a purpose. There is gain in pain. So, Father, I would just ask that these words of mine would be redeemed, that they would be redeemed in the hearts of my family and friends here. That, Father, that you would touch them in a way where they need to be touched. I have my own failings, I have my own foibles, I have my own sin. But Father, we can each bring our own to you. And Father, it's with that we come to your word, to allow it to be a mirror of our own lives, allow it to reflect to us where you are working in our lives. And Father, I am grateful for your restoration in my life. I'm grateful for the mercies that you show me every day. Father, I just ask for that continued restoration, continued mercy, and amazing hope that we as a church family together can look forward to. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.